Whitney Houston was 20 minutes away from the most humiliating moment of her career when a knock on her dressing room door changed everything. What Tina Turner whispered to Whitney that night didn't just save one concert, it saved the voice itself. This is the untold story of how rock and soul's greatest survivor became Whitney's guardian angel when she needed it most. Before you hear what happened that incredible night, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've ever had someone give you advice that completely changed your life. Because what you're about to discover proves that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when the cameras aren't rolling. It was November 15th, 1999, at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. Whitney Houston was supposed to be celebrating. Her comeback album, My Love Is Your Love, had been a massive success, proving to the world that the voice was back. But backstage 30 minutes before showtime, Whitney was living her worst nightmare. Her voice was failing her. "I can't do this," Whitney whispered to her vocal coach, Kevin Price, as she attempted another warm-up run. The notes that usually soared effortlessly were cracking, straining, betraying her when she needed them most. Her throat felt raw, constricted, like someone was squeezing her windpipe. "Kevin, I sound terrible. What am I going to tell 15,000 people?" Kevin had worked with Whitney for 3 years, through her struggles and her triumphs, but he'd never seen her this panicked. "Whitney, you just need to relax. Your voice is tired, but it's still there. We've been through this before." But Whitney wasn't convinced. For the past week, she'd been battling what she thought was just a cold. Late nights in the studio, back-to-back interviews, and the emotional strain of her marriage had taken their toll. "Look at me, Kevin," Whitney said, turning to face her longtime coach. "I haven't slept properly in weeks, and now my voice is giving out on me. This isn't just a cold." Kevin wanted to comfort her, but he could see the truth in her eyes. Whitney Houston, the woman with arguably the greatest voice of her generation, was scared. Not just about tonight's show, but about whether she was losing the gift that had defined her entire life. "I should cancel," she said, pacing the small dressing room. "I can't go out there and embarrass myself. Not tonight. Not when everyone's watching to see if Whitney Houston is really back. What if they boo me?" she whispered. "What if I open my mouth and nothing comes out? What if this is it, Kevin? What if this is how it ends?" That's when the knock came. 3 soft taps on the door that would change everything. "Come in," Whitney called weakly, expecting her manager or maybe Bobby checking on her. Instead, Tina Turner walked into the room. Not just any visitor, Tina Turner, the woman who had redefined what it meant to be a survivor in the music industry, the legend who had faced her own demons, rebuilt her career from ashes, and emerged stronger than ever. "Whitney, baby," Tina said in that unmistakable, raspy voice that had growled through decades of rock and soul classics. "I heard you might need some company." Whitney's eyes filled with tears immediately. Of all the people who could have walked through that door, Tina Turner was exactly who she needed, but never expected to see. "Miss Turner," Whitney managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I, I'm having some trouble with my voice tonight." The understatement hung in the air. It wasn't just trouble. It was the fear that every vocalist lives with, the fear that the gift that defines you might disappear. Tina closed the door behind her with quiet authority. She moved across the room with that distinctive stride, purposeful and powerful. "Honey, may I?" she asked, gesturing toward the chair next to Whitney's makeup station. As Tina sat down, Whitney noticed something powerful in Tina Turner's eyes, a depth of understanding that could only come from someone who had survived the impossible. "You know," Tina began, "in 1981, I was supposed to perform at the Ritz in New York. My comeback was just beginning, and I was terrified." Whitney wiped her eyes and leaned forward, something about Tina's voice already beginning to calm the storm inside her. "I was 42 years old, starting over from nothing. The music industry had written me off. And that night at the Ritz, my voice was shot from years of abuse." Tina paused, her gaze drifting to Whitney's mirror, where the reflection of 2 strong women sat side by side. "I stood in that tiny dressing room, looking in the mirror just like you are now. And I thought, Tina, you're 42 years old. Maybe it's time to quit. Maybe the critics are right. Maybe you should just disappear and let the world remember the old Tina, not this broken down woman trying to be something she's not." But Whitney could see in Tina's eyes that this story didn't end with giving up. But then I remembered something my grandmother told me when I was just little Anime Bullock back in Nutbush. She said, "Baby girl, your voice isn't just in your throat. Your voice is in your spirit." Whitney felt something shifting inside her chest, like a knot slowly beginning to loosen. "Miss Turner," Whitney said, "I feel like I'm losing myself. Everything used to come so naturally. I'd step on stage and it was like coming home. But now I second guess every note, every gesture, every breath." Tina nodded knowingly. "Honey, let me tell you something. I've watched you perform since you were just a young woman stepping into the spotlight. I've seen that light in your eyes when you sing. That moment when Whitney, the person, disappears and something divine takes over. That light doesn't come from your vocal cords, baby. It comes from something deeper." "But Miss Turner," Whitney protested, her voice cracking with emotion, "I can barely hit the high notes tonight. My range is shot. How can I perform 'I Will Always Love You' when I can't even sing it properly? How can I give them what they expect?" This was the question that had been haunting Whitney for weeks. The song had become her signature, her calling card, the performance by which all others were measured. But tonight, those soaring notes felt impossible. Tina smiled knowingly, the kind of smile that comes from having faced this exact demon and won. "Honey, let me share something with you that no vocal coach will ever tell you. Something I learned the hard way during my comeback years." She stood up and moved closer to Whitney, placing her hands on Whitney's shoulders with the gentle authority of an older sister. "The most powerful performances aren't about hitting every note perfectly. They're about connecting with people's hearts. And you, Whitney Houston, have never needed perfect notes to do that. Your gift isn't just technical perfection, it's emotional truth." What Tina said next would become the advice Whitney carried with her for the rest of her career. The words she would repeat to herself before every performance. The wisdom that would transform how she understood her own artistry. "There's a difference between singing with your voice and singing with your soul. Tonight, don't try to be the Whitney who recorded those albums in the studio, surrounded by producers and engineers demanding perfection. Be the Whitney who grew up singing in New Hope Baptist Church, who felt music before she understood it. Be the Whitney who knows that sometimes the most beautiful moments come from imperfection." Tina moved toward Whitney's makeup mirror, her presence commanding even in the small space. "Come here, baby. Let me show you something that changed everything for me." Whitney joined her at the mirror, and Tina placed her hands on Whitney's shoulders, both women looking at their reflection. Two generations of musical greatness. Two women who had carried the weight of extraordinary talent and extraordinary scrutiny. "Look at yourself," Tina said gently. "What do you see?" Whitney studied her reflection, seeing all the flaws, all the fear, all the exhaustion. "I see someone who's scared, someone who's tired, someone who might not be able to deliver what people expect." "I see someone who's human," Tina corrected, her voice warm but firm. "And that's your greatest strength, not your weakness. Those people out there don't need you to be superhuman tonight. They need you to be real. They need to see that even Whitney Houston struggles, even Whitney Houston has moments of doubt. Because if you can find your strength despite the struggle, then maybe they can find theirs too." Tina began to massage Whitney's shoulders gently, working out the knots of tension that had been building for days. "Now I want you to close your eyes and think about why you started singing. Not for record labels or Grammy Awards or Rolling Stone reviews. Why did little Whitney first fall in love with singing?" Whitney closed her eyes, letting Tina's hands work their magic, letting her mind drift back to simpler times. "In church, I sang because it felt like I was having a conversation with something bigger than myself, like I was part of something holy." "Exactly," Tina said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "And God doesn't care if you hit every note perfectly, baby. He cares that you sing from your heart. The congregation doesn't leave church talking about technical perfection. They leave talking about how the music made them feel." Tina moved her hands to Whitney's neck, applying gentle pressure to release the tension that was constricting her voice. "Your voice is tight because your spirit is tight. Everything you're carrying, the pressure, the expectations, the fear of failure, it's all sitting right here in your throat. Breathe with me." They breathed together, slowly and deeply. Whitney felt something she hadn't felt all week. Genuine calm, not the artificial calm that came from medication or alcohol, but the deep peace that comes from being understood by someone who had walked the same treacherous path. "Now," Tina said, her hands still working gently, "I want you to hum. Don't think about notes or technique or what the audience expects. Just hum whatever comes to your heart." Whitney began to hum Amazing Grace, the song that had first made her fall in love with singing, the song she'd learned at her mother Sissy's side in that small church in Newark. To her surprise, her voice felt clearer, more centered, more like itself. "Beautiful," Tina whispered. "That's your real voice. Not the voice that tries to impress critics or sell records, but the voice that speaks truth. That's the voice those people came to hear tonight." There was another knock on the door, more urgent this time. "Whitney, 10 minutes to showtime." Whitney's panic started to return like a wave crashing over the momentary peace Tina had created, but Tina squeezed her hands firmly, anchoring her to the present moment. "Listen to me carefully," Tina said, her voice taking on the intensity of someone about to share life-changing wisdom. "I'm going to tell you exactly what I told myself that night at the Ritz. The words that not only saved that show, but changed how I approached every performance afterward." Tina looked directly into Whitney's eyes, and Whitney could see decades of hard-won wisdom in that gaze. "You don't owe those people perfection. You owe them honesty. If your voice cracks, let it crack beautifully. If you can't hit a high note, find a different way to express that emotion. The audience isn't there to judge you. They're there to feel something. And Whitney, honey, you've never failed to make people feel something." Whitney felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of recognition. Recognition that she was in the presence of someone who truly understood the weight of being a woman in the spotlight, the pressure of living up to impossible expectations, and the courage it took to be vulnerable in front of thousands of strangers. "Miss Turner," Whitney said quietly, will you walk to the stage with me?" "Baby," Tina replied with a smile that lit up the small dressing room, "I was hoping you'd ask." As they walked down the corridor toward the stage, passing crew members who did double takes at seeing the two legends together, Tina shared one more piece of wisdom, her voice mixing with the growing sound of the crowd chanting Whitney's name. "You know what the real secret is, Whitney? Every great performer I've ever known, Diana, Aretha, Gladys, Patti, we've all had nights when our voices weren't perfect. But we learned that our imperfections often create our most memorable moments. The crack in your voice might be exactly what someone in that audience needs to hear tonight." They reached the side of the stage where Whitney could hear the crowd of 15,000 people chanting her name with an energy that seemed to shake the building. The familiar pre-show anxiety started to creep back in like an old enemy, but Tina placed a firm hand on her back. "Remember," Tina said, her voice somehow carrying clearly over the noise of the crowd, "your voice isn't just in your throat, it's in your spirit. And your spirit, Whitney Houston, is unbreakable. It survived your childhood in the spotlight. It survived the pressures of fame. It survived everything that brought you to this moment. Trust it." As Whitney's name was announced and the opening notes of her entrance music began to play, Tina whispered one final piece of advice that would stay with Whitney forever. Words that would echo in her mind during every performance for years to come. "Don't sing to impress them. Sing to heal them. And in healing them, you'll heal yourself." Whitney Houston walked onto that Staples Center stage carrying Tina Turner's words like armor. When she opened her mouth to sing her first song, "I Want to Dance with Somebody," something magical happened. Her voice wasn't technically perfect. There were moments where she chose power over precision, emotion over execution, but the audience felt something different. They felt truth. The standing ovation after that first song lasted 3 full minutes. Whitney had performed this song hundreds of times, but tonight it felt like the first time. The audience could sense something had shifted, something authentic was happening. Midway through the concert during "I Will Always Love You," Whitney's voice did crack on the climactic high note. For a split second, the old Whitney might have been mortified, but instead she smiled, looked out at the sea of faces and said, "You know what? Sometimes the heart sings louder than the voice." The crowd erupted in the longest standing ovation of her career. After the show, as Whitney removed her makeup and tried to process what had just happened, she found Tina waiting in her dressing room, reading a magazine as if she belonged there. How do you feel, baby? Like myself, Whitney replied without hesitation. For the first time in months, I feel like myself again. Tina hugged her tightly, and Whitney could smell her perfume, feel the strength in those arms that had literally held up the music industry for decades. That's because you finally sang like yourself tonight. Not like the Whitney you think people want to hear, but like the Whitney you actually are. Imperfect, human, beautiful Whitney. That night marked a turning point not just in Whitney's approach to performing, but in her entire relationship with her voice and her artistry. She began to embrace the imperfections in her voice as expressions of her humanity rather than flaws to hide. Critics and fans noticed the change immediately. Her performances became more emotionally powerful, more connected, more authentic. Years later, when asked about her greatest influences, Whitney would always mention that conversation with Tina Turner. She taught me that vulnerability is not weakness, Whitney would say in interviews. She taught me that the cracks in your voice can let the light in. Tina Turner's wisdom that night didn't just save one concert. It gave Whitney permission to be human, to struggle, to grow, and to connect with her audience on a deeper level than technical perfection ever could. The lesson of that November evening, that authenticity trumps perfection, became the foundation of Whitney's most powerful performances for years to come. The voice Tina Turner saved that night wasn't just Whitney's singing voice. It was her authentic voice, her true self, her permission to be beautifully, powerfully, imperfectly human. And in saving Whitney's voice, Tina Turner reminded us all that sometimes the most profound moments of healing happen when one strong woman reaches out to lift up another. What Tina whispered to Whitney that night became more than advice. It became a legacy of wisdom passed from one legend to another, proving that true greatness lies not in perfection, but in the courage to be real. That's the power of authenticity. That's the magic of mentorship. And that's how Tina Turner saved Whitney Houston's voice by teaching her that her greatest strength had always been her heart.